Hey, folks, and YouTube's just kicking in. And here we go. Great. Hey, folks, and welcome again to the 8:30 Live. So, as usual, we'll give it a second for folks to see that the little live notification is on so they can tune in. And to the brand new YouTube subscriber, thanks so much for subscribing. I hope that you'll be able to catch tonight's episode. In any event, now we're still waiting for folks to jump on. Usually I try to fiddle around with the sharing, but I'm not going to do that tonight. Let's just cover a couple of quick things in the news. There is one thing that I definitely want to say, which is I got a message from somebody who's a constituent of mine who told me Magna Carta tonight. Okay, yes, right, thank you. I wish I had remembered that before, because then I would have loaded up the Magna Carta before. But whatever. Also, my hair's crazy because I just took a shower. But you got to stay clean even in coronavirus land when nobody sees you. But first things first, actually, I'll get to this in a second. Obviously, I'm not outside violating curfew. And this is because I asked last night whether folks would like me to go outside. I have no problem violating curfew. And we've been over the philosophical rationale for why this curfew is nonsense. And by the way, it seems to be an abject failure because thousands of people marched across the Brooklyn Bridge last night and were trapped there by police for hours just on the bridge, incapable of moving. I actually think that when we talk about whether or not the police presence makes us safer or puts us in more danger, the thousands of people trapped in close quarters on the Brooklyn Bridge probably spread the coronavirus like absolute insanity. Even though people are close together when they march, when you're marching, at least you're moving and you have the capacity to distance. On the bridge, it was very clear that there was not enough room between a police barricade at the Brooklyn end and a police barricade at the Manhattan end for folks to properly space themselves out while on the bridge. And of course, because of the barricades, they couldn't leave and they were just kept there, detained, stuck on the bridge for hours. So absolutely unacceptable and ridiculous. And I would say that the police put people in harm's way last night, which is not to say that they haven't done other things in the past, which one might consider escalation or violence or misuse of force. But last night, they did the most that they could to trap the most number of people and do the most harm. So I thought that was absolutely unreasonable. But it just goes to show what effect curfew has had, which is not much. And folks are out again tonight. And the reason that I haven't taken the show outside is because folks contacted me and said that they actually want to be able to hear what I have to say and they want to engage in the conversation. And that, of course, would be a lot harder if I'm walking around on the street. There'd be ambient noise. And of course, I'd have to wear a mask. So we're going to do these indoors going forward for that reason. And then I'll have to find some other time to go outside. Unfortunately, I have a late night work call, so I'm not going to be able to leave the house tonight. But that is how it goes sometimes, perhaps tomorrow. In any event, we've already got some comments, so let's handle them. And then I'll get to this request from a constituent, which I really want to point out. So first, Deidre Levy. I'm out. I didn't mean to violate curfew, but I was doing deliveries to the shelter. An 8 p.m. curfew is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's people just walking around the block, I'm sure, completely oblivious to the fact that there's theoretically a curfew right now. The fact that you have a curfew before the sun goes down, so people can't even time it to the sidereal solar cycle, is nonsensical. Like, I don't know what the mayor was thinking, but he's not going to get very far, and it shows. In fact, the only thing that we've learned from this is that politicians' worst fears have come true, which is that people are more interested in peacefully protesting than they are in either chaos or order. They are out there working for change, and they're willing to do what it takes to achieve it. And next up comes voting. So absentee ballots are currently being sent out. If you haven't requested your absentee ballot, look in your mail for a ballot request form. Please differentiate between a request form and an actual ballot. And if you don't see that, go to nycabsentee.com and get your absentee ballot mailed to you so that you can vote. The election is on June 23rd. Send in your ballot. And if you can't get that done, you can still vote in person at a limited number of locations on June 23rd. But obviously, absentee is the way to go given the pandemic. Okay. Comment from Dorian Key. What do you think of this week-long 8 p.m. curfew? This is super long. Well, we spent a good long amount of time on that yesterday, so I will briefly recap, which is simply to say, I think it's absolute nonsense. I think that without a plan from our government about how they're going to address this crisis, it simply amounts to shutting people up, violating their First Amendment rights. It would be one thing if the government said that they would, at the end of this curfew, be putting forward a package of legislation to address the underlying cause and what people care about. But because their response is essentially be quiet with no plan or statement about how they are going to address the issue, it simply amounts to a violation of the freedom of speech. So I find this curfew to be completely invalid, and I'm glad that other people agree and are out there expressing their civil rights and dissatisfaction. Again, I would feel differently, probably, if the government had said, what we're asking for is cooler heads to prevail, and we're going to say, everybody, please stay inside, and we'll even enforce a curfew. But at the end of the curfew, we are going to have convened the legislature and come up with a package of proposals to address the problem. That's not what they're doing. In fact, there is very little talk about what the legislature and what the executives of New York City and New York State might do, other than Cuomo tepidly endorsed reform, but not repeal, of the Police Disciplinary Record Privacy Law, 50A, and said that he might consider removing Bill de Blasio from office. Bill de Blasio has done absolutely nothing except back up police brutality. And I'm not saying that all police are brutal, but Bill de Blasio went out of his way to back up videos in which the police were using excessive force or endangering people's lives. So this curfew that has been imposed is completely invalid and an abrogation of civil rights. What's the update on the murder hornets? All I can say is that I believe it was in LA, there was a call for police to address a swarm of Africanized bees, aka killer bees, and a lot of people got stung. And as far as I'm concerned, that is simply prelude to Murder Hornet Summit next year. Murder Hornet Summer next year. Bit of a tongue twister. So whatever. Now we have to put up with murder hornets and the fact that saying Murder Hornet Summer is not that easy. Regardless, Simon, I feel okay. Thanks. I do wish that I were outside, but for reasons that I already explained, people actually want to engage in conversation, and they don't want me just walking around with a mask outside. So I'll have to do my outdoors things after the live. There you go. Dorian Key, wasn't the main purpose of the curfew to stop the crazy looting that happened the past 2 days? Yes, that was the main idea. And I think what we're seeing is that most protesters don't want looting to take place, and that many protesters have decided to take it upon themselves to corral the folks who are instigating. So at least from what I've seen, the protests, I believe, have gotten more peaceful. There was a report of shooting in Brooklyn last night, but I want to let folks know that if you hear about a report of a shooting in Brooklyn, that it is unrelated to the protest, that this was about a domestic dispute, at least as far as I read. And so I think it really seems like the folks who are out right now in curfew understand that it really is incumbent upon them to be good actors, to behave, to be on their best behavior, so that the police and our elected officials understand that, again, what people want is change, not to riot. Insofar as that, maybe imposing the curfew had the knock-on effect of making people sort of realize that they need to corral the rowdier elements, whether they are part of the protest or they are provocateurs. But that self-policing has taken place. And honestly, the self-policing is both more effective and has been a lot safer than the actual policing. So let's just leave it at that. However, what I do want to address is that 2 nights ago, some vandals did mess up a pharmacy in Chinatown, and one of my constituents messaged me with pictures. And I just want to encourage everybody who is protesting to please do that self-policing. If you see somebody who's acting out, please, hey, Dom, how's it going? Good to see you. Please try and stop them don't put yourself in harm's way, but please draw attention to the fact that they are doing something that is harmful to the protest movement, and try and engage other folks around you who you trust or if you feel safe, because we really do want to stop folks, not just because it looks bad for the movement, but in this particular case, a pharmacy was broken into and looted, and the person who contacted me was concerned for their grandmother, who uses that pharmacy to get medication which she needs to live and stay healthy. So there are knock-on effects when you loot or vandalize the community stores that people need to live. So bodegas, grocery stores, even ATMs, honestly, people need a way to get their cash. And it is really, really a burden when your bank is knocked over and now you have to travel 5, 6, 7, sometimes a mile, 7 blocks, sometimes a mile or more away just to get cash, because there are places in this city which are financial deserts. And it's not fair to those neighborhoods to deprive of easy access to all the things that maybe other people take for granted. And pharmacies is one of those really, really important community institutions that people rely on to get medicine that keeps them healthy. So if you see people doing these things, please try and stop them. Again, don't put yourself in harm's way. Draw attention to it. Ask them politely to stop. If you feel physically able or physically safe, or you have other people with you, try to intervene in the best way you think possible without getting physical. Again, we don't want to be using excessive force like the police. We simply want to try and have a safe protest environment. And this can generally be done with words. There are lots of videos of folks in the protest telling off agent provocateurs and explaining to them why it's wrong to do what they're doing, and then having those people stand down. So there's a few comments, and then we'll get to the next thing. Julianne, Cuomo did not mention 50A in his presser until he was asked about it by a reporter. He also said how the police were his friends growing up. I'm getting really pissed. Well, you know, the police union is quite powerful. They have a ridiculous amount of money, and all of their members vote. Now, not all of them live in New York. So there's that to consider. And one of the police reforms which has been proposed is to require more police officers who operate in New York to actually live in communities in New York. Now, there is a thing in the police department where you don't patrol your own neighborhood, and there are valid reasons for that. But I don't think that you should be completely divorced from the community that you're policing. We don't want folks from New Jersey or from upstate or folks who live in Westchester who have absolutely no connection to the people and identity of New York City to be policing us, at least not the majority of them, because then they have no investment in positive and community outcomes. So that just says, and then Dominic says, oh yes, hey Ben. Dom, it's great to see you. Let me plug your thing. I don't know if you're still watching, but if you can put the info for your thing with Jumaane Williams in the comments, that'd be great, because then I can promote it. So Dominic DeRubio used to be president of the Staten Island Young Democrats. Staten Island, of course, being where a large number of police officers live. In a lot of ways, it's the Republican stronghold of New York, and a lot like New Jersey. It's as far away from New York as you can get while still being in New York City. Oh, I don't know if Dom would fight me on that. But what I will say is that Dominic is an expert in safety and OSHA and some of the really important things that we need to consider when we're talking about our essential workers and PPE and standards that keep folks safe in the workplace. And he's doing a panel discussion with Jumaane Williams, who's the public advocate, and another person who I didn't know, soon. So if you're still around, please pop that information in the comments. Julianne, killer bees have been here since the 80s. Yes, but there was an incident where a nest was found and a lot of people got stung and somebody was sent to the hospital. And this was like yesterday or 2 days ago. And Dorian asked about murder hornets. So this is prelude to murder hornets. Dominic DeRubio, happened today, recording up on PA Facebook site. Oh, sorry, Dom. F. Okay, well, check it out. Go to Jumaane Williams' Facebook page and you can see Dom in action. So just a few more things that I wanted to mention today. First and foremost, folks are probably aware, but I think we need to shout it from the rooftops. The Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has received the case. So the Hennepin County Attorney was relieved of control of the case against Derek Chauvin, or however you say it, and the 3 police officers who watched him kill George Floyd. The governor took that out of the Hennepin County Attorney's hands and gave it to the state Attorney General. So the state Attorney General, Keith Ellison, has decided to up the charges against Derek Chauvin from 3rd-degree murder to 2nd-degree murder, and has charged all 3 of the other officers who were there with accomplice to 2nd-degree murder. So this is a pretty big happening. This really says a lot about the degree to which that state is taking this seriously and will be moving to impose a real form of accountability on these officers. Now, it's likely there'll still be a grand jury, which is common in high-profile cases. And then we'll have to see how the case goes down and how aggressively Keith Ellison pursues it. But as somebody who's known as a pretty staunch progressive, as a man of color himself, and a former congressman, I suspect he'll go at it pretty hard. And then we'll just have to see what the judge says. But these are some very positive signs coming out of Minnesota. But of course, we have a lot to do right here in our home state. And this isn't about focusing on Minnesota and what Minnesota has to do. This is about a national problem of racism, police militarization, police brutality, and inequity in the law. So that is absolutely a great indication coming out of Minnesota. But let's keep the pressure on. Just because that's happening, I don't think there's any reason to stop protesting. There's no reason to stop calling for change. And until we get some real movement in every state, I think we should keep going at it. That being said, speaking of the various states and their interaction with law enforcement, you might remember that Donald Trump promised to roll out the military to impose order. Well, first and foremost, I think that we're demonstrating that the protesters are fine maintaining order and that you can have the First Amendment be completely compatible with folks out in the street, curfew or not. But there have been some incredibly wonderful statements today, and I just want to go through them. There were 3 statements from 3 top-ranking military and defense personnel which indicate that the military will not back the use of force against the American people. And these 3 folks are, first and foremost, Secretary of Defense Esper. Secretary of Defense Esper came out and said that he did not know that the force being used against protesters outside of the White House was going to be basically used to stage a photo op in front of a church. And he came out on the side of the protesters. And this is really big because the other 2 folks that I'm going to mention served in the military and are highly regarded in the military, but are no longer in the administration. The Secretary of Defense technically runs the Pentagon and runs the military. And so when a sitting or acting Secretary of Defense comes out against the president's use of the military, it's pretty big. We might expect his resignation soon, but it's big. The other 2 are the former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and Mad Dog Mattis, who was the former Secretary of Defense, Trump's first Secretary of Trump's first Secretary of Defense, and one of the most highly regarded people in the military. Now, I highly encourage you to read Mattis's statement, because it is not just about the deployment of the military on U.S. soil as Trump asked for it, but about the presidency as a whole. And Mattis is notoriously respectful of the chain of command and doesn't tend to speak out. He's been silent basically since he resigned over Trump's handling of Syria. That being said, he wrote a blistering takedown of Trump's presidency and the direction that the United States is taking and the leadership that we've seen on display, or really lack thereof. So these are 3 incredibly high-ranking, well-regarded people in the United States military who have now gone against the president's desire to use military force on the American populace. And what this signals is that if the president were to order the use of military force, it's entirely possible that the military wouldn't go along with it. And you can sort of see that Donald Trump understands this and that the military has made it clear to him, because the federal agents which are now involved with enforcing Trump's idea of law and order are ICE and Border and Customs Patrol. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But I also want to point out how incredibly insane it is and completely outside the character of the United States military to even quietly tell the president that they're not going to listen to him, right? That's basically what this is. Nobody who's in the military, no acting general, nobody on the Joint Chiefs is actually going to come out and oppose their commander-in-chief. That would be a tremendous breach of decorum and probably lead to an immediate dismissal. I would imagine it's a direct violation of the chain of command. But the fact that some of the most highly decorated, highly ranked, and highly respected military leaders who have left the service and who had been recent leaders in the military are saying this, are sending a very, very clear message to the folks who are the generals now and who are commanding the military. And again, the statement from the Secretary of Defense goes even further, because that person, though not in the military and doesn't formally follow the chain of command from the commander-in-chief, is obviously in charge of military logistics and military planning. And my hair is going absolutely nuts because it's drying post-shower, and now it's just flying all over the place. But whatever. Let's just talk for a second about who Trump is deploying to the, quote, war zone, which is ICE and Border and Customs. So these are, the federal government is not a policing organization. Almost all policing is done to states, or left to states and localities, particularly cities. That's why New York City has a very large police force, and New York State has like some troopers. What the federal government does have are the FBI, which are federal cops effectively, and immigration and Border Patrol police. And the important thing to remember about ICE and Border and Customs is that if you are within 100 miles of a border, and a border includes all the coastline of the United States, they can violate certain constitutional rights to detain you for a time without trial and to bring you in without probable cause and such. So it's extremely important now that folks be very, very much aware of their rights, not just their protest rights, but also their rights when it comes to interacting with Border Patrol agents. Check out the ACLU because they have many guides on the various different types of interactions you can have with police officers, either while you're protesting or if you're interacting with ICE and Border and Customs Patrol. And it's just really, really important to keep these in your back pocket if you decide to go out, because again, these two particular agencies are empowered to basically violate your civil liberties. It's ridiculous, but that's just how it is. ICE and Border and Customs Patrol don't have that large a staff. It's like, it's effectively impossible for them to police the way that we think of police, thousands of people in a single place, going block to block, but they do raids. And when they do raids, it can be extremely dangerous. And because we have these large crowds, they'll often raid crowds looking for immigrants in particular, but now they've had their purview expanded to simple policing measures. So extremely dangerous. And all right, no more comments. Where's all the chit chat today? Yesterday it was like a tremendous amount, just a flurry of words from everybody. No more? Okay, that's okay. We still got we got 4 other things we could theoretically talk about. But next general topic, now that we've addressed the military, let's talk about what's going on with the National Guard, because there's 2 stories about the National Guard, which are very interesting. The first is the Tennessee National Guard. So I don't know if you saw this, but the Tennessee National Guard there were 2 different incidents actually in Tennessee. One was in Nashville where there was rioting and it was chaos, but a happier and ideally exemplary moment for the National Guard came in the state's capital. And there were protesters, and the National Guard, recognizing that the protesters were not a real threat, put down their shields and stepped back on the Capitol steps as protesters advanced, and simply let people protest by the Capitol. And then, as Democratic legislators left the Capitol building, they went past the National Guard line and joined the protesters. And as the National Guard slowly began to put down their shields and disarm, nothing happened. It was a beautiful, wonderful moment of de-escalation, and that is exactly what we need to see happening. Not a situation where people are yelling and so the police fire pepper spray, causing a panic. Police acting responsibly, protesters behaving in a way that is non-threatening. Again, kneeling, I think, is great, or just standing still quietly in front, or just chanting or singing peaceful slogans, not some of the more aggressive slogans that I've definitely heard, and I'm sure lots of you have heard. And then for the police to put down their shields or to holster their mace cans so that people can see a gradual de-escalation. Every time there's an aggressive or violent or perceived violent act, people ratchet up. And then there's no reward for behaving. There's only a response for misbehaving. So every time somebody doing that's slightly more aggressive, there's an immediate response to that aggressiveness. But if you go the other way, if you de-escalate, if one side unilaterally de-escalates, there's almost never a corroborating response from the opposing side. And as a result, tensions only go up. They don't come down for the most part. And this comes from a lack of training and a lack of mediation, and a fact that fear is a more powerful motivator than hope, I suppose, would be the opposite. So, it's extremely difficult to de-escalate, which is why we should expect it from the police, not necessarily from the protesters. I understand fear is a motivator. Nobody wants to get hurt. And even as you de-escalate, you feel fear. But it is the trained personnel who have to be the bigger people in any altercation. That is actually what this is all about. You are empowered to do harm. If you are given weapons to do harm, if you have the license to pull out a gun or pull out mace or hit people, then it is incumbent upon you as a representative of the state, empowered to do these things to show that you are not going to resort to violence as your first step. It's not what we're seeing, and it is absolutely what we need to see. I think that's one of the reasons, the British police, unfortunately, they do this less now, but for a long time, there were entire segments of the police force in the United Kingdom that simply didn't carry firearms. And one of the reasons for that was it was a de-escalatory tactic. If you know that somebody's not going to shoot you, then you don't have to behave as violently towards them. It's when they're a threat to your life that tensions really ramp up. Now, we said this yesterday. Of course, the United Kingdom has an entirely different relationship between the citizenry and access to firearms. So this is not necessarily a prescription for the United States because of some of the other issues we have going on. But the idea of de-escalation coming from the police, coming from the government, that I think is an intensely valid perspective. Dorian Key, what exactly is opening on June 8th? Well, gyms open. No, gyms are like phase 3. Sorry. Government buildings will open on June 8th. That's sort of the most of it. It's generally government buildings and slightly less essential services. So like, I believe schools are phase 1 or limited schools and daycare centers, so that, it's all about whether or not parents can go back to work and get the economy going. Same reason that school starts in high school at like 7 a.m. Why does school go from 9 to 3? It's not because that's the sleep cycle of a teenager. Everybody knows that teenagers sleep in. And districts where they've experimented with having high schoolers go in later actually have higher success rates for students. But the reason we do it this way, and the reason we have a summer break, is because we want people who are decently grown to be working, and generally children, people of the age of 14, you have to get a special sign off from your parents to work at 14, but people between the ages of 14 and 18 before college are the ones which receive the lowest wages. So the entire rationale for the school day ending before the workday ends is so that you can have cheap child labor. And the entire rationale also for the summer break being how it works is so that you can have children who are available to work on the farm. True story. And we just haven't gotten away from that. So that being said, our economy is still geared around supplying the largest number of workers for the least amount of money, which is why schools and daycares and such are in phase one. Schools are not phase one. Okay, schools are not phase one. Scrap what I just said. Government buildings are. I think daycares are. I still think daycares are. But gyms are like at the end. Gyms are in phase three for Bill de Blasio. Honestly, I don't care what Bill de Blasio says because he's not in charge. The governor is in charge. Where are gyms on Bill de Blasio's phases? I looked at the phases like once 3 weeks ago. So pardon me for not knowing them like the back of my hand. I do know that gyms are in phase one. That's for damn sure. Gyms are one of the best places to spread the coronavirus. Where gyms fall, you got me. But I can almost guarantee you they're not opening on June 8th. Well, that and schools are also out of session. So, like, the school year is over. No, it's not over, but, like, we're getting there. Bill de Blasio had already said that schools will be out for the remainder of the school year. Simon Sachs. Ben, for your friend Dominic, what should parents with underlying conditions do with their kids? If they go back to school, doesn't it put the parents in danger? Yes, it would do that. But again, school is not coming back into session. Deidre corrected me, and I had forgotten that Bill de Blasio had already said that schools will not be reopening this year. Michael Kaplan, just signed on. Don't know if you brought up the idea. I bounced off you, but it would be curious as to what people think. Okay, we'll get to that in just 1 second. Simon asks, what should teachers with underlying conditions do in the fall? We don't know 100% whether or not people will be going back to school in the fall, although that is certainly the expressed desire of the mayor that people do go back to school in the fall. Ultimately, there's guidance as the phases of reopening. So each phase of reopening has prescriptions for things that you should do. And then the CDC also has their opening plan, which again was scrapped or not released by the Trump administration, but it was leaked. So you can see it online. I imagine a lot of localities and governments will be following those sorts of suggestions, which have to do with like the regularity of cleaning and disinfection, ways to disinfect, the amount of PPE you need to provide, distance between people and such. But there isn't really a set plan right now for what happens when people go back to school in particular. That's a really tough one because you've got a bunch of kids. Kids are hard to control. Right now, you've got the governor talking about, quote, reimagining education and bringing in a whole bunch of tech people to redo the whole system. So that is rather unknown. Julianne, he went to the gym when everything was complete in lockdown. Again, I see what you're saying. I see what you were saying. The gym isn't in phase 3 for Bill de Blasio because Bill de Blasio doesn't adhere to any rules. Okay, I was pretty sure that gyms are phase 3 for the governors for the New York State plan. I was pretty sure Bill de Blasio's plan, if he had one, doesn't matter because the state supersedes. And I understand that what you were saying was a joke, just that Bill de Blasio doesn't care about rules and went to the gym himself. Yes, well, that's the guy, isn't it? Deidre Levy, teachers can consult the UFT. Teachers with compromised immunity should not be going to school in the fall. I would agree with that. But what will happen to them? Great question. Don't know the answer. We'll have to wait and see. I'm sure the union will be fighting hard for their rights to pay and such. And I'm saying the above because my coworker was the first teacher to pass in the DOE due to COVID. Yes. So Deidre is a teacher in Brooklyn, and one of her coworkers very sadly passed away from the coronavirus after schools were kept open deep into March for teachers who had to continue to go to work even after school was canceled to receive training on distance learning. And And even after the city knew about coronavirus cases in schools, they continued not to shut down the facilities. So that was a very, obviously that's very sad. And of course, we shouldn't have people exposed to something that could kill them if at all possible. So speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about protesters and coronavirus and some of the added risks that we've come across now. And this is tear gas. We're going to talk about tear gas for a second. So first and foremost, it is, of course, hazardous to be outside in large groups. And even though you are outside, which is better than being inside, the closer you are to people, obviously, the higher the risk of transmission. And I have seen almost all people, honestly, wearing masks, which is great. There are some studies that say that masks do nothing. There are some studies that say masks, if everybody wore a mask, transmission would drop by 80%. I think it's reasonable to suspect that masks do something, if not everything, and that as long as you're outside and keeping several feet apart, even if not 6 feet apart, you're in better shape than you otherwise would be. That being said, it is, of course, a high-risk situation to go outside and participate in these things and be shoulder to shoulder with people, and that was certainly the case on the Brooklyn Bridge last night. However, there are things that can be done which aggravate the problem of coronavirus, and one of these things is tear gas, which hasn't really been used much in New York, but has been used pretty liberally in lots of other places, including Washington, D.C. And if you experience tear gassing, you should know that tear gas is essentially an asthma attack. I mean, yes, it attacks your eyes, but it absolutely 100% as a gas attacks your lungs. You'll find it hard to breathe, they'll be burning, and there can be some damage. And as the immune response comes to clear out your lungs, that is the same response. The inflammation there is the same as asthma, and also similar to the effects of coronavirus. And as we all know, asthma is one of the important pre-existing conditions that leads to adverse outcomes for people exposed to COVID-19. So if it happens to turn out that you're protesting and you're exposed to coronavirus and you're exposed to tear gas all at the same time or within a few days of each other, it could end up being a complicating incident for your case, which is bad, which means that some of these non-lethal tactics which police are practicing might in fact be somewhat lethal. I think it's worth mentioning that under the Geneva Conventions, tear gas is illegal. It's effectively a war crime. The only reason that we can use it against our own population as crowd control is because, and we went over this last night, we are not at war. Whatever people want to say about a war zone, as long as we're using tear gas, there's no war because we are ignoring the Geneva Conventions, and we can only do that when we're not at war. Well, I suppose that's not true. I love to say all the time, and I did see that my good friend who studies international law in Europe popped on for a second, and I'm going to take this opportunity. I don't know if she's still here, but I do want to take this opportunity to reiterate there is no such thing as international law because there's no such thing as international law enforcement. So, yes, we're not supposed to use tear gas in a war, but if Donald Trump felt like it, he could order it, and if the military decided to go against it, then that's one thing. But if they chose not to go against it, who's going to stop us? Nobody. It will just be a bunch of condemnation from a bunch of other countries who will say, you really shouldn't do that. And I'm sure Donald Trump will say, I don't care. And then he'll withdraw from the Geneva Conventions and start torturing people. In any event, let's hope it never gets there, because then that's a real descent into dictatorship. And I am very heartened. One of the big questions about whether or not a country can descend into dictatorship is whether or not the military is with the strong man. If the military does not back the dictator, then it's very difficult for them to impose their rule, because the army, and this is not what we want, but the army will intervene or will fail to enforce the edicts. And because we have localized police forces, it's not up to the president to command them or direct them. And it's unlikely that a national edict from the president would compel police officers in most of the country to do anything. It really revolves around the use of the actual army and military. So just just referencing back what we spoke about earlier, the statements from leading figures in our armed forces is very, very heartening to me. It is honestly, truly heartening to me to see that. And I did worry for a time whether or not the military would go along with what Donald Trump said because of the chain of command and because to a large extent it's been infiltrated by white supremacists. But the upper echelons of the armed forces are clearly not on board with Trump's agenda. And so I'm not saying it's impossible, but it provides some comfort for those of us who are concerned that the army may side with Donald Trump in a conflict between governors and the president or the American people and the president. Let's see what we got here. Julianne, it was frightening. I was doing practicum. I couldn't believe they dragged their feet. Dragged? I think dragged their feet as long as they did. I'm still very angry at them. I don't know who you're talking about. But leave a comment and tell us. Dorian Key, with the UK giving Hong Kongers green cards by the millions, could the CCP and China stop its people from leaving, especially the richer Hong Kongers, and seize their assets? The answer to your question is yes. Absolutely 100% yes. There have been travel restrictions in China. There's still travel restrictions. And there's also a ridiculous amount of money restriction, right? For a long time, there were two types of currency, one for foreigners and one for Chinese people, so they could control the money supply. Your question is very similar to like, was it illegal for people to leave the USSR? And it was. That's one of the big problems with the totalitarian regime. So the answer is yes. But usually if you have enough money, you can figure out how to get out. So there's that. And I'm sure many of the richest folks in Hong Kong have stashed some resources in offshore accounts. That's just the nature of the game. Ellie Martinez, can Congress step in some way? The answer to your question is ish. And I've said this many, many times, but Congress doesn't have an army. Congress doesn't have an army. So Congress can do like two things. They can pass a law restricting what the president can do. But just so that you understand, the president is already not allowed under the law to unilaterally put military units on the ground to quell disturbances on U.S. soil. That's already illegal. So we're already living in a world where the president wants to do something illegal. Congress could also defund the military by passing a budget which allocates them no money, in theory, causing their efforts to grind to a halt. But then I'm sure Donald Trump would just take the money. The problem is that the executive is ridiculously powerful. And if people want to go along with what he says, particularly the people with the guns, there's not a really great way to stop them. So it's super duper important for people with the guns to uphold their promise to not obey unlawful orders. That's something that you do in the military. You swear to uphold the Constitution, not to obey the president, and you are informed that you should not obey unlawful orders. Which is not to say that the military doesn't do unlawful things all the time. The command to not obey unlawful orders is in direct tension with the command to obey the chain of command. And people are, of course, worried about being court-martialed, about getting in trouble, all of these things. But when the top brass states its preference or states its belief that what the president wants to do is illegal, it basically says to all of the lower-ranking people, feel free to obey an order like this. And as we saw from the National Guard, there are folks in the National Guard who are putting down their shields even while they're on duty. And there are now a number of cases throughout this country where National Guard members are refusing the call to duty. They are wondering how they can get out of the National Guard because they do not believe in the deployment of the National Guard against U.S. citizens. And this is not something that really happens often. People don't just defect from the National Guard or from the military. So that is really big. It's quite a big deal. Let's see. Michael Kaplan, French Revolution. Soldiers would not fire on the crowd. Same thing with the fall of the Soviet Union. The army would not, fire on the crowd and would not fire on Boris Yeltsin. So the hardliners of the Communist Party, who had ordered the military to take out I don't want to call them revolutionaries because technically Yeltsin was supposed to be in power, but would not fire at the command of the Communist Party. That's when they realized that the game was up and that they had to cede the USSR to the new Russian Federation. Deidre Levy, yeah, I can't believe they took a long time to decide whether schools should be closed. Oh, replying to Julianne, apparently. Dorian Key, did you see Mad Dog Mattis article in The Atlantic? Yes, I saw it and I urged everybody to read it because James Mad Dog Mattis, as he is known, is one of the foremost and most respected people in the armed forces. Well, he's retired now, I suppose, 4-star general. And he wrote an excoriating takedown of Trump and his presidency. Okay. 2 more things I wanted to mention. Oh, no, just one more thing. Oh, no, 2 more things. So we didn't get the second. We didn't get to the second thing about the National Guard stuff. Okay, folks, I want to point this out. I think it's really important that we all be cognizant of this because this is similar to what was going on in Ukraine. And this might be a one-off. It might not be. I hope that it is. But basically, in LA, soldiers found somebody posing as a National Guards member. There was a man, Greg Wong, who had dressed up in military gear and was carrying an assault rifle and ammo and was posing as a member of the National Guard. This person was not a member of the National Guard and was simply parading around as one, pretending to be with a live assault weapon. Now, this has really deep implications. And even if it's a one-off, it means that we have to be extremely on our guard. So first, we've spoken about deep fakes recently, and this is like a real-life deep fake. It's when you can't tell the difference between what's real and what's false and misrepresentation. So the first real danger here is that somebody posing as a member of the military with an actual weapon can do tremendous damage to the reputation of the National Guard and the military and any attempts at de-escalation. It's basically the same idea as your instigators who pose as protesters but are only there to start stuff and make the protesters look bad. If you have somebody who is posing as a member of the military who claims to be an agent of the US government and then does things like shoot people, that makes headlines. It makes headlines and it makes people distrustful of the police and of the armed forces and makes them think that they're putting their lives in danger. And again, we spoke about how fear feeds escalation and impinges de-escalation. And so this is tremendously dangerous in that regard. The other way in which it's dangerous is that this infiltration of the military is a tactic that foreign powers use to discredit governments and gain military intelligence. So posing as freedom fighters or what have you was one of the ways that Russia launched its attacks in Ukraine. It didn't send in its own military because that would be blatant and cause an international incident, but it sent people who were pretty obviously Russian military to pose as freedom fighters and law enforcement officers in Ukraine and as Ukrainian militants to be partisans under the cover of, to be Russian soldiers under the cover of Ukrainian partisans. So this is a really fascinating situation, which I think it's potentially extremely dangerous. And we all need to watch out for this sort of thing. But luckily, it seems to be a one-off, and soldiers recognized him because his uniform apparently wasn't quite perfect, so they were able to spot him and call him out. So all this to say is you really have to check what's real and what's not these days. Misinformation is the weapon of the day, and it can be used to cause extreme chaos and create a lot of damage and hurt a lot of people. So just something that I wanted to make sure folks were aware of. We talked a bit about misinformation yesterday and how you got to check your sources. Well, now when you see folks on the street, you got to check and make sure that they are who they claim they are, particularly if they say they are representatives of one group or another, be they protesters, be it the government. Deirdre Levy, what is the deal with these bricks being, quote, mysteriously placed? There are flyers that claim funded by George Soros. The flyers obviously seem fake, but it's very weird. I sincerely doubt George Soros is wasting his money moving bricks around. I mean, the dude has so much money, like, that's such a tremendous... Yeah, George Soros, I don't think has any real reason to do that. The police have a reason to do it, and there have been some videos of police behind it. White supremacists have a reason to do it, and there have been some videos of that. But the deal with the bricks being mysteriously placed is to instigate riots. There's no two questions about it. It's to instigate vandalism and make hurting people and creating damage easy by providing weapons. So it is very weird. It is very dangerous, and we should really attempt to get to the bottom of who's behind it. But it doesn't look like it's the protesters. I'm pretty freaking sure it's not George Soros. And it is an incredible problem. And again, it simply speaks to the fact that misinformation is the name of the game, and we have to do a much better job as a country and as a society being critical thinkers and understanding that not everything is as it seems to be, vetting sources, looking at the raw data and the raw footage of events, and investigating and checking up on people if they claim, again, to be representatives of a certain perspective. Michael Kaplan, German forces posed as Americans behind lines just prior to the Battle of the Bulge. It's a well-regarded military tactic akin to spies, right? Sleeper agents, spies, and disguising yourself as the enemy is absolutely a tried and true tactic of war. Okay, Dorian Key says Magna Carta time, and I will oblige him. All right, let's talk about the Magna Carta. Now, this was a series we've been doing for some time, and then we started having lives that went really, really, really long. And so I stopped doing it because I wanted to go eat. But, oops, I have no internet on this computer, so now I have to connect to the internet. But basically, we had been going over the Magna Carta and looking at how the tradition of English law impacted the way our country operates, and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and sort of where these ideas of Enlightenment thinking and individuality and individualism, I should say, come from. So I believe we had gotten to section 7. So prior to this, we had dealt with the preamble, which was basically the listing of all the folks involved, lots of bishops, lots of lords, lots of barons, blah, blah, blah. Then we spoke about section 1, which was basically the rights of God. So the Magna Carta is really, it's often referred to as the British Constitution. It is not that. It is an agreement between the lords and the king, which set out and prescribed some limitations on the monarchy. But it doesn't really have the force of constitution. The British certainly don't treat it that way. In theory, it can be amended by Parliament because it's an instrument of Parliament. But that being said, the first section was about the rights of God, not the rights of lords, not the rights of barons, certainly not the rights of people, but the rights of God. So their first section is basically the opposite of the First Amendment to the United States. Then section 2, to all free men of our kingdom. And again, this just simply focuses it on the idea that men are free, maybe not so much women. And really free men meant the earls and barons, as they are delineated here. And it spoke about how the transference of their property of their land could not be stopped by the monarch. A monarch could not simply seize their property after they died, and it could be passed on to their heirs if there were a tax paid. Okay? Then it spoke a little bit about how if the heir is underage, there shall be a guardianship of the heir and the land, and that guardianship shall be overseen, and that the guardian will be appointed by folks close to that family, and the guardian is limited in what it can do. They can't take all the land for themselves, they can't transfer the property, and they certainly can't marry off the heir without informing the next of kin, because that would be bad. And that brings us to where we are. And we're going to talk a little bit about women today. How exciting is that? We've not really heard anything about women, only about children and men of property. At her husband's death, a widow may have her marriage portion and inheritance at once without trouble. She shall pay nothing for her dower, marriage portion, or any inheritance that she and her husband held jointly on the day of his death. She may remain in her husband's house for 40 days after his death, and within this period, her dower shall be assigned to her. 8. No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband. She must give security that she will not marry without royal consent if she holds her lands of the crown. If she holds her lands of the crown, or without the consent of whatever other lords she may hold them of. Okay. So section 7 and 8 talk about the widow of an Earl Baron after that Earl Baron has passed. And it is basically, this is actually really interesting because in a lot of societies, women were not allowed to own property and could not inherit. But it's clear here that under the Magna Carta, the widow, one, is allowed to inherit, and it implies that there are lands that a widow may hold, which are grants of the monarchy or of other lords. So the way you get land in a monarchy is the king or the queen or the monarch bestows it upon you. So basically everything belongs to the crown, and then you're given land at their leisure. So you're usually an ally. You're an ally of the crown, or maybe your family fought for the crown in a war, or you're knights, and then you get estates granted to you. Almost all of this is about the rights of people to keep the estate that the crown had already granted to them and prevent the arbitrary seizure of that estate. And this is where we get a lot of our ideas of private property and limited government, because sure, this is about landed aristocracy and the prevention of the monarch from taking land that was granted by the monarch in the first place. But ultimately, this becomes this. So Magna Carta is 1215. The Enlightenment period comes after this and all that. And that's where we get the idea of private property and limited government, and the belief that the government, the state, should not be willy-nilly able to simply appropriate the wealth of individuals. And this, of course, underpins so much of our society. Obviously, we have arguments over taxation, which is the government appropriating a degree of individual property, but it's completely limited in how it does that and constrained by representation out of the English tradition. As we were just talking about, because of Dorian Key's question regarding China, in an authoritarian regime, if the leadership, the political masters of the country don't like you, they can simply appropriate all of your wealth. They can prevent you from leaving the country. They can take all your land. They can take all your money. And this is a lot of what Putin does to keep the oligarchs in line. So here, in this section of the Magna Carta, we have another class of person who's protected from the wanton acts of the monarch. And these are actually women who are allowed to inherit wealth, women who, now it says she shall pay nothing for her dower. And what I believe this is I have no idea what a dower is. I can only assume. And what I'm imagining this is the dowry that was paid. So when you got married back in ye old bad days, the woman's family paid the man's family a dowry, which was basically like, thanks so much for taking this useless woman off our hands. Here's some money. So like, that's why the bride's family now traditionally expected, or I don't know if it's expected anymore, but traditionally the bride's family paid for the wedding. That's the dowry. So she shall pay nothing for her dower, marriage portion, or any inheritance that she and her husband held jointly on the day of his death. So basically, what this says is she owes no taxes. She's not going to pay anybody, say the sovereign, for the dowry, which I guess she now inherits, or the marriage portion. So that's what the dowry was, or any inheritance that she and her husband held jointly. So what this says is actually that while women were married, they could hold property jointly with their husbands. So that's pretty progressive for the times, I have to say. I'm a little surprised to hear that, which is quite cool. And then it says she may remain in her husband's house for 40 days after his death, and within this period, her dower shall be assigned to her. So within the 40 days after his death, she gets her dower back. She inherits that, but then she has to leave her husband's house. I guess unless that was somehow willed to her. Although no. Interesting. I suppose the husband's house as part of the estate goes to the heir, which was discussed just prior in the document. But if there's no heir, who knows what's happened? Oh, actually, it says we covered what happens if there's no heir, I think. But whatever. I am not gonna go back and read it because we covered it. So go watch a previous episode, like from last week, where we started going through the first 6 sections of the Magna Carta. Then it says that nobody can compel this widow to marry, which I think is quite nice. When we spoke about heirs could be compelled to marry if they were below the age of inheritance. Effectively, they could be compelled to marry by the guardian that assumes control of the barony or the earldom. But widows can't be compelled to marry as long as she wants to be without a husband, which gives her a fair degree of autonomy with all of her inheritance. But she must guarantee basically that she won't marry without royal consent if she holds royal land, or without the consent of whatever other lord she may hold them of. So again, all land belongs to the crown, and then other lords may give land to subordinates or what have you. And so what this is saying is the woman is entitled to inheritance and may control land, but that land ultimately belongs to somebody else. She may control it just as her husband controlled it, but it's unclear whether this is because she's a woman or whether this was also a restriction on men. We haven't gotten that far in the Magna Carta, but I imagine it probably isn't. But that if a woman wants to marry because of the shifting alliances that creates and the control of resources, land basically, that comes with it, you need to get consent from the person who actually owns the land. So that would be the crown. If it's royal land that was granted to the widow, well, really to the husband, and then transferred to the widow by inheritance, that came through the sovereign or from another lord. Either way, you have to get their permission to forge a new alliance through marriage. But overall, I'd say this is so far a rather progressive document, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see that women did have some agency outlined in 1215, at least in the United Kingdom. Now, tomorrow, so that's what we're covering today. We covered women today. I just want to give you a glimpse of next week, or whenever we cover this next. Maybe it could be tomorrow. But Section 9 is about debtors, and Section 10 is particularly about if Section 10 and 11 are particularly about if you borrowed money from Jews. So I really look forward to getting into that. I'm not going to read ahead, but my gosh, that's fascinating. Being Jewish myself, I can't wait to see what they had to think about Jewish folks in 1215 England. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to call it a night. See you tomorrow at 8:30.